Hey guys, this is your lesson on the South and the West, 1865 to 1900. One thing to note about this lesson, as in the previous lesson, the city and political life, these are subsets of our study of the industrial boom. Everything that's taking place, you can see that I've noted here, is taking place between 1865 and 1900. And once we finish these first 3 or 4 units, we will then be able to move forward chronologically in time. But let's take a look at the objectives for this unit. I'm not going to take the time to read them to you, but as I go throughout the presentation today, you'll notice that I highlight where you will find specific information regarding to each objective. At any time throughout this lesson, please be aware that you can specifically look at the Prezi itself. You can find that on Blackboard in your course. Just remember that if you don't want to hear the audio portion, or if I go too fast through the presentation, you can always go back and check the presentation on your own. So we're looking at the South, and the conditions after the war were bad. You know, the whole Sherman's March to the Sea, 3,000 miles of scorched earth. The South was destroyed. So Reconstruction literally was just trying to rebuild the physical portions of the South. This is just an example of a town. I don't know if the city, I don't know, this may be Savannah, but literally just ripped apart. These are things like we see in Europe after World War II, but this is in our own backyard down south. So as we try to start rebuilding, and again, it's not only just a physical rebuild, but it's also, social and economic. The wealth is down, and the military is placed in the South, not necessarily to protect the rights of the newly freed African Americans. More, though, the military is there, though, to really just get into the face of the Southerners and let them know that they lost. Just kind of, a little jab every time someone sees the Northern Republican, or the Northern Union Army, I should say, in the South. It's just a reminder that they lost the war. The military was supposed to be stationed in the South until the South met a certain number of requirements, such as pledging loyalty to the Union and guaranteeing African American rights. Again, the reasons for the South's condition the way it was, as bad as it was: total war, natural loss, loss of life, and end of slavery. This is a huge economic impact to the South. When they lost their slaves, they now no longer have anyone to work the fields for free. They have people to work the fields, but not for free. So profit margins are at a critical loss. The Northern Republicans proposed solutions, and the Northern Republicans are in charge. Once secession occurred, Southern Democrats pulled themselves out of office, and so now that the war is over, there is no one to challenge the Northern Republicans. There are some Northern Democrats, but they're an extreme minority. So now that the war is over, the Northern Republicans can basically pass any law, any act that they want, and there's going to be no one to challenge them. And with Lincoln, Lincoln was going to be very lenient to the South. Now that Lincoln is dead, again, no one's going to stop them. Congress deals with Johnson by trying to impeach him, but basically they run him out of office after finishing Lincoln's term. Again, they basically have no one to stop them. They're going to do whatever they want, and what they want is to make the South pay physically, mentally, emotionally for this war. A lot of the acts that were passed, Civil Rights Act, this is kind of a precursor to the 14th Amendment. Freedmen's Bureau, it's a agency designed to help newly freed African Americans in their new lives with education, building homes, job training, anything you can think of to get started in their new lives. Money was set aside for the Freedmen's Bureau. Of course, 14th, 15th Amendment, 14, citizenship, 15, rights to vote for African American males. Military enforcement, again, this is designed to ensure that the South was giving rights to African Americans, and the military was going to be there until the South pledged loyalty. The South was divided up into like 5 military districts. And then the Enforcement Acts, this comes later once we see the rise of the KKK, the Southern reaction to Northern Republican legislation. Newly freed African Americans, they do enjoy their life, but it's difficult because they have no training and no education. What they know is farming. Take a little moment here to pause. The African Americans were really excited about the 40 acres and a mule proposal by Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, and William Sherman, General Sherman. Johnson wanted had nothing to do with that, though, because it wasn't his idea, and it was giving more rights to African Americans and giving personal property to African Americans, which he disagreed with. But that's what they wanted. That's what they knew. So they said it over and over and over again. Here's how you can help us. Southerners obviously oppose all this because it's given African American rights. Imagine yourself. I don't know how to say this without being not politically correct. You own slaves, and now the government's telling you that they are equal to you. It's without getting into the whole moral issue. I mean, some of these slave owners were brought up their entire lives believing that slaves were nothing more than livestock, and now they're being told that they are equal to them. And by equal, I mean equal in status, in political power, and in everything. And so groups rise up to try to retain the integrity of the white race, and specifically that's the KKK. I guess that would be the Southerners' reaction to it. Now, back to the African Americans, their response, they try to, in their new life, adjust to their newfound freedom, but all they know is farming. They don't have enough money or education to buy their own land, so they resort to sharecropping. Sharecropping, like it says there, nothing more than legalized slavery. Essentially, a farmer makes a deal with a large landowner. That landowner dictates what is grown and how much of the harvest comes back to him. Usually it's like 60-70%. So that leaves the sharecropper with somewhere around 40 or 30% to sell in the market, which is never enough. Well, before they even get started, they get charged high interest rates. They have to borrow money from the local store for seed and materials, plows, things like that. And then come harvest time, they never make enough money to pay back their debt. So it's just in a never-ending circle of debt, and eventually it leads to legalized slavery, which we'll get to in a little bit. Debt peonage, that's what we're referring to there. Debt peonage is a way for landowners to have slaves, essentially, legally. Let's say you have a debt and you can't pay back that debt, well, you get thrown in jail, because that makes sense, because you're going to make a lot of money in jail. So the landowner then goes and pays your debt for you. You are now legally indebted to him, and so you work for him until the debt is paid off. Well, the landowner is creative, and he charges interest, and so you may pay off the principal, but you will never pay off the interest that you owe on this debt. So essentially you work for the landowner until you're dead. Again, the landowner can dictate what's grown. Cotton obviously is grown in the South, along with other crops. Cotton's probably not number one crop in the South at the time. But because the sharecropper has such a small portion of the harvest, it's never enough to make enough money to sell. So African Americans take advantage of the Homestead Act around 1860. The government was passing this act that allowed for 160 acres of land to be given away free to the head of the household. The only requirement was that they farm the land for 5 years and they make it profitable. So African Americans move west. This group is known as exodusters. The term exodus, as you can see there, means to move, and it's out of the South, long dusty trails. Exodusters. Exodus, like the book of the Bible, talking about the children of God wandering through the desert on their exodus. The New South, we call this the New South because it's the South after the Civil War, is mostly unsuccessful simply because they don't have the infrastructure in place to be successful. See, the Northern Republicans wanted to make the South industrialized, and as opposed to an agrarian-based society or economy. And what the railroads provided the North in the victory in the war, the South did not have. And frontier-like conditions remain for generations. We're talking about dirt floor cabins, outhouses, no plumbing, things like that. And there's really no chance to get out of debt because the economy is shattered. Loss of political power is probably the number one negative effect in the eyes of the former plantation owners. This loss of political power refers to not only do they not have a voice in Congress in D.C., but also their votes are being canceled out by the newly arriving African American votes, and African Americans are 99% voting Republican because, well, the Republicans set them free, so why not return the favor by keeping them in office? We get to the 1877 election, talking about the Compromise of 1877. Republicans throw up Hayes as their candidate. Democrats, Tilden, he's from the North in New York. He's one of the few Democrats who stayed in Congress because he was a Northern Democrat. Pretty much a tie, even with the power that the Republicans have. The election comes down to a tie and has to be broken by the Electoral College. The votes are disputed. I think it's, to be quite honest, I think it's in Florida. Imagine that, Florida messing up an election. I think it's in Florida where there's a disputed election. Democrats realize they don't have enough votes to win, so they meet with the leaders of the Republican Party in a hotel room behind closed doors, secretly, and they make this compromise. Basically, they stated that we will give you the election, we'll give you the presidency if you pull your military out of the South. Republicans were more concerned with power and keeping the presidency than they were with making sure African Americans had their rights guaranteed, and so they take the bargain, they make the deal. They pull the military out of the South, and that begins over 100 years of prejudice and racism and the Jim Crow eras toward African Americans in the South. On the regular Prezi, just the regular Prezi, go through the presentation. I encourage you to check out this website. It gives you an idea, an origin about where this name Jim Crow came from. It's quite, I don't know about entertaining, but it's enlightening. Just a few stats about income in the South compared to the United States and land ownership. Again, if I'm going too fast, you can always go through the regular Prezi. Now, this way of life lasts in the South and basically until World War II. When the Great Depression hits and the northern cities are experiencing horrible economic situations, the South looks up and says, "What are you talking about? Welcome to our world," because that's just the way it is. World War II, we get into, in the New Deal, we start to see more industrial expansion in the South, especially with the TVA, but essentially they lived this life for many, many years. On to the west and the frontier. Land is extremely harsh. You can see a map there. We're talking about this west is essentially the Great Plains where we live today. Again, the Homestead Act, the purpose of the Homestead Act was to encourage people to move out of the east and to the plains to make this large area profitable for the United States. Now, when the farmers get out here, they realize that the land is slightly different than the land back east. I think I have a slide showing you. Yeah, there's soil samples. On the left, you see a soil sample of what the ground looks like back east in Ohio, and it's just lush, deep, maybe a little bit of clay in there, and then on the right you see soil from the Midwest. You dig down 8 inches in Midwest soil and you're hitting rock, and very, very dry. So the tools that were successful for farmers back east are not working out here in the west. So back to this slide, necessity is the mother of invention. The farmers have to build tools that will allow them to be successful in farming this new land out here. As people begin to settle, it's wide, it's varied. There's a lot of isolation, 30, 40 miles between farms and families. And this is typical of American expansion from the beginning. We have colonies, then we see colonies expanding to the Appalachians, and then from the Appalachians we see expansion to the Mississippi, and then expansion all the way across the coast. During this period of expansion, you're going to have periods of isolation where there's not a lot of people around you, and it's not until the more and more people move that your population increases. Just a little timeline there. You can see our expansion across the west. Gold is discovered obviously in California, but also parts of the South and Northwest. The cattle industry is a major industry at this time. We learned cattling. We learned cattle driving from the Mexican cattle farmers, the vaqueros. This becomes a huge industry after the Civil War. The demand for beef back east and far west, like San Francisco, it becomes a major commodity. So cattle drives up through Texas, Oklahoma, and Kansas become pretty profitable. Very, very hard, very long days, hard life, but profitable if you can be successful, if you can escape Native American tax, losing cattle, losing your own life. It can be fairly profitable. So the cattle's driven to Abilene and Dodge City, where they're loaded up on trains and taken to Chicago. Now, we've talked in the past about the big industries, the big factories in Pennsylvania and New York City. Chicago has a major industry, the slaughterhouses. This is where all kinds of livestock are taken to be slaughtered. And this is a pretty decent industry for many, many years. And bonanza farming out in the West as well. Railroads were given land by the government as part of the Homestead Act. No, I'm sorry, not the Homestead Act. As part of the encouraging of the building of rails across the West. And I think later up in the slideshow here, you'll see some specific numbers, but essentially the railroads did not sell the land to individual farmers like the government hoped they would. The railroads sold it to large-time investors, and these are the people who create bonanza farms, these over 1,000 acre farms of a single crop like corn, and it floods the economy, it floods the market with a single crop, causing prices to fall. The problem with bonanza farms is that if you get some kind of blight or disease on your crop, say like corn, it's going to wipe out the entire crop, all over 1,000 acres. And that's why you see the bonanza farm only lasting a period of 5 years. As I stated earlier, technology becomes a major problem or a major need for the farmers in the Midwest. And we see development of not only the train brings the people to the West, but other technology like barbed wire. We wouldn't think that of as technology, but it is. Anything that improves your way of life is the definition of technology. So there's your different styles of technology. Of barbed wire. Barbed wire is made out of the new metal that was recently developed in the time called steel. Then we have the steel windmill used to pump water up from the ground. The mechanical reaper is probably the biggest development because this job can do the job of 20 men with 160 acres to farm. Once harvest season comes around, you can't harvest 160 acres with you and your 3 sons. So this machine was developed to harvest large tracts of land over a short period of time, and it becomes very profitable. The harrow, fancy name for a rake. You can see the farmer sits in the seat and, horse-drawn, oxen-drawn, rakes it up. Once you cut the wheat or the corn, then you rake it into rows, and then you can bind it up. And finding life on the plains, as we've talked, it's isolated. They live in sod homes. It's a pretty fancy sod home. It's even got a chimney. Sod is the top 5 or 6 inches of grass and dirt out here in our plains states. Most of the plains states have Bermuda grass, very thick, entangled grasses, and so it actually does make pretty good bricks. Even the roofs are made out of sod. But it's not the DoubleTree Hotel. Farmers are paying outrageously high prices for their goods, and the Sears and Roebuck Company and Montgomery Wards get involved in items that are needed for farmers, and they can sell mass quantities, and because of that they can sell it at a very, very low price. So this helps farmers with prices and low interest rates. Of course, out here on the plains, you guys know we have all kinds of crazy weather. The belief that the rain follows the plow is not necessarily true. If there's going to be a drought, there's going to be a drought. There's nothing you can do about it. If it's going to be a flood, there's going to be a flood. It's just so difficult to tell the type of weather we get out here on the plains states. And so for the life of the farmers, it's hit and miss. And then of course winters, we're having an extreme winter. There's times when we have snow in May. So that can wipe out a herd pretty quickly. There's more information about the cattle drives, as I've already mentioned. Locust, again, wiping out a single crop without any problem at all. As more and more people move out west, obviously things get better, the sharing of ideas and the like. I think you have a question or an objective referring to commercial farming. Again, that's referring back to the bonanza farms. Here's your statistics. The government was giving railroads miles or acreage of land for every mile laid in a state. 10 square miles in a state, 20 square miles in a territory. The reason for the more land being given to the railroads in a territory is because of the possible Native American attacks. So your life was a little bit more in danger out in the territory as it was in a state. The government again hoped that the railroads would sell these to small-time farmers to encourage movement out west, but that didn't happen. They were out to make money, so they sold it to large individual investors. And that is the end of this unit. Again, take advantage of the Prezi minus the podcast, minus the audio, if things were moving too fast for you. Thanks, guys.